The Barrett M82 never lied. That was the first thing Douglas Winslow taught his daughter on a cold Montana morning when she was 8 years old and the rifle was nearly as tall as she was. He had knelt beside her in the frost-stiff grass, his big hands guiding her small ones, his voice low and patient, the way it always was when something mattered. The world will lie to you, Dara. People will lie. Circumstances will lie. But the rifle tells you exactly what you give it. Nothing more, nothing less. She had not fully understood it then. She understood it now. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 0047 hours on a Sunday that felt like every other Sunday for the past 3 years. Staff Sergeant Dara Winslow sat cross-legged on the concrete floor of her barracks room, the components of her Barrett M82 arranged on a worn field cloth in the precise order her father had taught her. Upper receiver, bolt carrier group, barrel assembly, each piece cleaned, inspected, and set in its place with the kind of care most people reserve for things they loved. Because she did love it. Not in a way she could easily explain to someone who had never held a weapon that could reach out nearly 1.5 miles and change the course of a battle with a single breath. She loved it the way a carpenter loved a well-balanced tool, the way a musician loved an instrument that had learned the shape of their hands. The Barrett had been her father's before it was hers, and before that it had belonged to a war she had only ever seen in photographs. The serial number etched into the receiver read M82-041-DW, Douglas Winslow. She ran her thumb across the letters in the dark, the way she always did, the way she had done 1,000 times before missions that mattered and missions that did not, and long, quiet nights when the weight of carrying his legacy felt like both a burden and a compass pointing true north. Her father had carried this rifle through the Kuwaiti desert in 1991. He had used it in conditions that would have broken most men, in heat that warped the air into something almost solid, in a war that the country had largely forgotten, but that had never fully left his eyes. He had survived Desert Storm. He had survived Somalia. He had survived 2 tours in Iraq. He had come home each time, quieter than before but intact, still himself, still the man who could read wind in the movement of grass and explain the Coriolis effect to a 10-year-old girl using nothing but a garden hose and patience. He had not survived the burn pits. The cancer had come quietly, the way the worst things always did. By the time the diagnosis arrived, it was already late. Too late for the treatments to do more than buy time. Douglas Winslow had spent those borrowed months doing what he had always done. Teaching, talking, passing forward everything he knew, because he understood that knowledge left unshared was knowledge that died. He passed away in the spring of 2018, 3 months before Dara earned her sniper tab. He never saw it. That absence lived in her chest like a splinter that had worked itself too deep to remove. She placed the photograph she always carried back into its waterproof sleeve. Her mother, gone to ovarian cancer in 2003 when Dara was 7. Her father, gone to a different kind of poison 15 years later. And between those 2 losses, a childhood spent learning to be still, to be patient, to let the mathematics of ballistics substitute for the chaos of grief. Douglas had understood what she needed before she could name it. He had given her the rifle, the discipline, and the 4 words she carried in her jacket pocket on a piece of paper worn soft at the creases from years of handling. Trust your fundamentals always. He had written it the day she left for basic training. She had carried it to every deployment since. The encrypted phone on her bunk vibrated once. She looked at it. The prefix told her everything before she read a single word. Joint Special Operations Command did not call at 0047 on a Sunday because things were going well. Staff Sergeant Winslow. This is Colonel Hargrove's office. You have a fragmentary order. Pack your gear. Wheels up in 4 hours. Afghanistan. That is all I am authorized to say on this line. Acknowledge. Acknowledged. The line went dead. For exactly 3 seconds, Dara sat motionless. Then she moved. The Barrett went back together in under 30 seconds, each component sliding home with the mechanical certainty of 1,000 repetitions. Her deployment bag was already 90% packed, another habit inherited from Douglas, who had always said that the soldier caught flat-footed when the call came was the soldier who made mistakes under pressure. She added the last items with practiced efficiency, extra ammunition, hand-loaded to her own specifications. Her ballistic notebook, 5 years of data written in her precise handwriting, temperature variations and wind readings, and performance logs from every significant shot she had taken in training and in the field. Her father's photograph, and the worn piece of paper already in her jacket pocket where it always lived. The C-130 Hercules was cold and loud and smelled of hydraulic fluid and canvas, the way military cargo aircraft always smelled, the way she had come to associate with the particular kind of loneliness that preceded violence. She was the only passenger among pallets of supplies destined for various forward operating bases across a country that had been consuming soldiers and ambitions for longer than most civilizations lasted. The loadmaster, a young staff sergeant who barely looked old enough to vote, offered her earplugs and a bottle of water, and then wisely left her alone. She spent the first hour of the flight reviewing terrain maps on her encrypted tablet. The topography of eastern Afghanistan had a brutal simplicity to it, mountains stacked against mountains, valleys that funneled wind in ways that could add 8 or 9 inches of drift to a shot at distance. She had operated in this terrain before. She respected it the way you respected anything that could kill you without malice, without intent, simply by being what it was. In the third hour of the flight, she opened the ballistic notebook to the inside back cover and read the entry she had made the previous week. Range data, atmospheric corrections, the kind of information that aged and required updating. She made 3 small notations in the margin and closed the notebook. Outside the porthole, the world below was dark and enormous. She let the engine noise fill the space where sleep should have been. Forward Operating Base Keller sat on a ridge in Kunar Province like something the mountain had reluctantly agreed to tolerate. It existed in the narrow category of installations that were small enough to be forgotten by logistics officers and significant enough to matter to people who understood what happened in the valleys below it. Security was layered and deliberate, multiple checkpoints, hardened structures, the kind of serious infrastructure that spoke of operations that did not appear in press briefings. The heat hit her the moment the ramp dropped. Afghan heat was different from other heat. It had weight and presence, a kind of physical insistence that required acknowledgement. The air carried dust and jet fuel, and something older underneath, the particular scent of a landscape that had been contested ground for so many centuries that conflict had become part of its geology. A lieutenant with ranger tabs was waiting at the LZ. His bearing was professional, his expression carefully neutral. Staff Sergeant Winslow. Lieutenant Graves, I'm your liaison. He glanced at her rifle case with the brief professional assessment of someone who knew what was inside it. The Admiral is waiting. Admiral. The word recalibrated her assessment of the situation immediately. Flag officers did not involve themselves in individual soldier movements unless the stakes had reached a level that made delegation feel irresponsible. She filed the information and followed without asking questions she knew would not be answered until they reached wherever they were going. The building they entered was unremarkable from the outside. Reinforced walls and a cipher-locked door, and nothing to distinguish it from a dozen other structures on the base. Inside, the air conditioning was aggressive, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in the space of a single step. The lieutenant led her down a corridor to a conference room, knocked twice, and opened the door. The silence that followed her entry was the particular silence of a room full of professionals who had expected something different. 15 men sat around a table covered in maps and satellite imagery and the organized debris of serious tactical planning. Every one of them wore the tan uniforms of naval special warfare. Every one of them was a SEAL. The collective weight of their experience was almost a physical presence in the room. Decades of combat operations compressed into 15 pairs of evaluating eyes. And every one of those eyes said the same thing without a word being spoken. This is a mistake. At the head of the table sat Rear Admiral Curtis Aldridge. He was in his early 60s, with the kind of face shaped by decades of sun and wind, and the particular discipline of someone who had operated at the highest levels of military violence for his entire adult life. His hair was gray and cut high and tight. His rows of service ribbons told a story that began in the Persian Gulf and had not yet finished being written. His eyes were the color of cold water, and they missed nothing. He was looking at her file when she entered. He set it down when he saw her. The silence stretched for 2 full seconds before he spoke. "Who authorized this?" It was not a question. It was the verbal equivalent of the expression on his face, which carried the controlled displeasure of a man who had learned to manage his reactions without eliminating them entirely. "I asked for a verified long-range precision shooter." He glanced around the table, then back to Dara. "Command sends me a staff sergeant from Bragg." He paused. "No offense intended, Staff Sergeant." "None taken, sir." His eyes moved to the rifle case she carried, then back to her face. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did a rapid and unflattering calculation. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Fenn sat to Aldridge's right. He was 38 years old and built like someone who had decided a long time ago that his body was a tool and had maintained it accordingly. A scar ran along his jaw from some previous engagement that he had apparently survived by refusing to acknowledge its seriousness. He leaned slightly toward the Admiral and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "This is a mistake, sir." It was not cruelty. Dara had been around enough operators to recognize the difference between cruelty and the blunt efficiency of men accustomed to filtering every variable through the single question of whether it would get their people killed. Fenn was not dismissing her out of contempt. He was dismissing her out of the same instinct that had kept him alive through more engagements than most soldiers experienced in entire careers. That distinction did not make it easier to stand in front of 15 of the most decorated special operators in the American military and feel the collective weight of their doubt. Master Chief Boone Callard sat further down the table, 52 years old, 30 years of service, a face that looked like it had been left out in weather for most of those decades. He watched Dara with eyes that were not hostile, only measuring, the way a craftsman looked at a piece of material before deciding whether it was suitable for the work at hand. Aldridge set down her file and folded his hands on the table. "Staff Sergeant Winslow, your file says you qualified as an Army sniper 3 years ago." He paused. "What is your longest confirmed kill?" 1,843 meters, sir. Helmand Province, 14 months ago. Moving target, confirmed by 2 spotters in aerial surveillance. A few of the SEALs exchanged glances. An 1,800-meter shot on a moving target was the kind of thing that got attention regardless of who had made it. Mountain warfare experience? 11 months in Kunar and Nuristan provinces, sir, operating at elevations between 6,000 and 11,000 feet. Aldridge's expression did not soften. He had the look of a man who had already made up his mind and was now collecting evidence to justify the conclusion he had reached before she walked through the door. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your service, but this mission requires precision at distances that represent the outer boundary of what any shooter has ever accomplished under field conditions." He picked up her file again, briefly. "I'm going to contact command and request they send someone with a verified record at extreme range." He moved toward the door. Dara's chair scraped back. The sound was quiet, but it stopped him mid-step. Every head in the room turned. She stood, and something in the quality of the way she stood, the absolute absence of apology in her posture, the stillness that was not passivity but its opposite, made the room recalibrate without knowing why. "Admiral, permission to show you my credentials, sir." He studied her for a moment, with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years reading people in situations where misreading them cost lives. Then the door opened again. The man who entered was 67 years old and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned decades ago that efficiency of motion was a form of respect for time. His hair was white, cut military short. His face had the weathered quality of someone who had spent the better part of his adult life outdoors in conditions that were unkind to skin. He wore civilian clothes, but his bearing was unmistakably military, the kind that did not wash out regardless of what you put on. Colonel Raymond Hargrove. Admiral Aldridge said it with the tone of someone introducing a fact rather than a person. Retired, best wind reader in the business. He'll spot for whichever shooter takes this mission. Hargrove did not acknowledge the introduction immediately. His eyes moved across the room with the methodical sweep of a man who had spent his career evaluating environments before entering them fully. Then his eyes found the rifle case leaning against the wall near Dara's position. He went very still. It was the stillness of recognition, of a man who had seen something that reached backward through time and pulled him into a moment he had not expected to encounter again. He crossed the room slowly. His hand, when he reached out to touch the case, was not entirely steady. His fingers found the serial number etched into the hard plastic near the handle and stayed there. M82-041-DW. The room was completely quiet. Hargrove's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Douglas Winslow's rifle. He looked up. His eyes found Dara's face. You're Doug's daughter. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had greeted Dara's entrance. That silence had been the silence of exclusion. This was something else entirely, something that had weight and direction and the quality of a room full of hard men encountering something they had not prepared for. Yes, sir, Dara said. He passed it to me. Hargrove straightened slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, and the room stayed quiet with him. Then Admiral Aldridge said, Colonel, you know this rifle? I know this rifle. Hargrove set his hand flat against the case, a gesture that was half inventory check and half something more personal. Douglas Winslow and I ran Overwatch together. 2 deployments. He paused. He was one of the finest Marines I ever served with. He looked at Dara, and this time the measurement in his eyes had changed its unit of measure entirely. Show me your weapon, Staff Sergeant. Dara opened the case. The components of the Barrett lay in their custom foam housing with the ordered precision of a lifetime's habit. She assembled it with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this in darkness, in sandstorms, in the back of moving vehicles, who had done it while exhausted and afraid, and certain that the next few minutes would determine whether people she cared about lived or died. 28 seconds. She set it on the table and turned to face the room. The fluorescent lights caught the badges on her chest, and Admiral Aldridge's eyes moved across them with the attention of a man who had spent enough time around exceptional soldiers to know what he was reading. The Distinguished International Shooter Badge. Top 3% of international military marksmanship competition. Fewer than 50 currently serving American soldiers had earned it. The Presidential Service Badge with crossed rifles and a single star. Not awarded for participation. Awarded for operations conducted at the direct request of the highest levels of National Security Command. And then the pin that Aldridge's eyes stopped on. Small, unassuming, not in any official insignia catalog. A silver bullet on a black backing, handmade, passed between snipers who had witnessed or accomplished things that the official record could not adequately contain. Aldridge had been around long enough to know exactly what that pin meant. He had been around long enough to know that the number of people currently wearing it could be counted on 2 hands. He had also been around long enough to know the name that went with it. Dear God. His voice was barely audible. The room held its breath. Your Phantom. The name went through the conference room like a current through water. Lieutenant Commander Fenn stood up from his chair without deciding to. Master Chief Callard's expression broke open for the first time. The careful neutrality replaced by something that looked like a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about the last 30 seconds. Phantom, the ghost sniper. The shooter whose call sign had circulated through special operations communities across every service branch for the past 18 months, attached to things that seemed like the kind of stories soldiers told to make the night feel smaller. 6 kills in 12 seconds. Shots through angles that the physics should not have permitted. A confirmed engagement at a distance that the after-action report had filed under anomalous and then classified at a level that kept it out of most databases. Aldridge's face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession and arrived at something that combines shock with the particular vulnerability of a man who realizes he has nearly made an irreversible error. He sat down. Slowly. The Kandahar operation, he said. 18 months ago, the SEAL team. My godson was on that team. Lieutenant Callum Aldridge. He stopped. You were the supporting asset. The name was redacted. Dara met his eyes and said nothing. The after-action report said 6 kills in 11 seconds, Fenn said. His voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely. He was looking at Dara with the expression of a man who had been handed information that required him to rebuild something he thought was finished. We assumed it was Delta, or a specialized unit. Nobody considered that the shooter might be an Army staff sergeant, Callard finished. Honest the way men were honest after 30 years of consequence, without apology, without performance, and without the luxury of pretending the error had not been made. Hargrove moved around the table and stopped directly in front of Dara. He extended his hand, and when she took it, his grip was firm and sustained, communicating things that the words around them were not quite managing. Staff Sergeant Winslow. His voice was rough with something that decades of military discipline had not entirely managed to contain. I knew your father for 20 years. He was the best I ever worked beside. He paused. He told me about you. Had a photograph in his kit. Said he was teaching his daughter to shoot, that she had a gift for stillness. Dara kept her face neutral, but the effort it required was not small. He would be proud, Hargrove said, of all of this. Admiral Aldridge set her file down on the table for the last time. He looked at Dara with the expression of a man who had just understood that the story he was telling himself about the last 20 minutes was the wrong story. Staff Sergeant Winslow, he said, I owe you an apology. I let my assumptions run ahead of my judgment. He was quiet for a moment. My godson came home to his wife and his daughter because of what you did in Kandahar. I've wanted to find the person responsible for that for a year and a half. He paused. I didn't expect to find her in my briefing room while I was questioning whether she belonged here. Dara acknowledged this with a nod that was neither small nor large, the appropriate size. Aldridge turned to address the room. Staff Sergeant Winslow is now the primary shooter for this operation. Her requirements are our requirements. Her timeline is our timeline. He looked around the table. Does anyone have a problem with that? Silence. Then Aldridge clicked the remote in his hand, and the screen on the wall came to life, and the face of Commander Tariq Saleh looked out at them from a surveillance photograph taken in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. The briefing was specific because the situation demanded it. Salah had been responsible for coordinating Taliban operations across 3 provinces for the better part of 2 years. He had designed the IED network that had killed 17 American soldiers in the preceding 14 months. He had planned the 2012 ambush in Kunar province that had taken 4 Rangers who had not come home, men whose names Hargrove did not say out loud, but whose absence sat in his expression like something he had been carrying for 11 years. Intelligence assets had been tracking Saleh for 6 months. He was cautious. He moved constantly. He surrounded himself with experienced fighters who understood their work. Yesterday, Aldridge continued, we got a window. Saleh is meeting with 2 other senior commanders at a compound in a mountain valley 40 kilometers from this position. Our sources confirm he will be there for 48 hours before moving again. He pulled up a satellite image of the compound. The location was a natural fortress, steep mountains on three sides, a narrow valley approach that would turn any ground assault into a casualty event. Multiple defensive positions arranged with professional attention to overlapping fields of fire. Aldridge moved the laser pointer to a ridgeline on the opposite side of the valley. The only viable option is a precision strike from this position. One shot, we eliminate Saleh. Then the assault team moves in under the resulting confusion to capture or kill the secondary commanders and recover whatever intelligence materials are on site. He paused. The distance from the hide site to the target is 2,387 meters. The room took a breath. Dara was already calculating the downward angle, the atmospheric density at altitude, wind deflection across multiple terrain features, the Coriolis effect at this latitude, the thermal currents that would rise from the valley floor as the morning sun heated the earth. At that distance, in those conditions, the margin for error could be measured in fractions of a second and fractions of an inch. There was no version of this shot that did not require everything working correctly: the rifle, the ammunition, the weather, the mathematics, and the person behind the trigger operating at the outer edge of what human precision could achieve. 3 experienced snipers had already looked at this problem and declined it. Dara looked at the satellite image and felt something settle in her chest. Not calm, exactly. Something more specific than calm. The feeling of a problem that was genuinely difficult aligning with a set of skills that had been built, deliberately and at considerable cost, to address exactly this kind of difficulty. She thought of her father kneeling in the frost-stiff Montana grass. The rifle tells you exactly what you give it. Nothing more, nothing less. She looked at Aldridge. "Tell me about the morning prayer schedule," she said, "and the wind patterns in that valley between first light and 0800. The briefing continued. Outside the reinforced walls of the building, the Afghan mountains stood in the early morning light, indifferent and ancient, wearing away the centuries with the patience of things that had outlasted every army that ever believed it understood them. The shot had not been made yet, but the person who would make it had arrived. The firing range at 8,100 feet felt like the top of the world. The air was thin and cold despite the Afghan sun climbing toward noon, and every breath carried a fraction less oxygen than the lungs expected, a fact that mattered considerably when the difference between a good shot and a perfect shot lived in the steadiness of respiratory control. Dara had operated at altitude before. Her body knew the adjustment, had made it dozens of times. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in the muscles were different conversations. And she had learned long ago that the range was where you had those conversations before the mission demanded them. She stood at the firing line with the Barrett already assembled on its bipod, the rifle resting on the packed earth like something patient and inevitable. The sky above the Hindu Kush was the particular shade of blue that existed only at altitude, too deep to be ordinary, too clear to offer any mercy from the sun. Colonel Raymond Hargrove stood 8 feet behind her with his arms crossed, watching. He had not said much during the drive out. He had looked at the terrain, made occasional notes in a small, weatherproof notebook that appeared to be older than most of the soldiers on the base, and asked 2 questions that seemed unrelated until she thought about them long enough to understand that they were the same question asked from different directions. How did she think about distance? And how did she think about time? She had given him honest answers. He had nodded and written something down. Now he watched her set up with the evaluating patience of a man who had spent 4 decades separating competent shooters from the other kind, and who understood that the difference between those categories was not visible in the equipment or the technique. It was visible in the quality of attention a person brought to the work of preparation. Dara pulled 3 boxes of ammunition from her pack and arranged them on the shooting bench in a specific order. Each box was labeled in her own handwriting with load data, powder charge, and the date the rounds were assembled. Federal brass cases, 660-grain projectiles, but each box represented a different powder lot that she had tested across different temperature ranges over the preceding 8 months. She produced a digital scale accurate to a tenth of a grain and began weighing individual cartridges, setting aside any that fell outside her tolerance window. Hargrove watched this process for 2 full minutes before speaking. "You really do load your own ammunition." It was not a question. It was the tone of a man confirming something he had suspected but wanted to see with his own eyes. "Factory ammunition is built to a standard," Dara said, not looking up from the scale. "At 2,000 meters, a variance of 0.2 of a grain in powder charge translates to approximately 3 inches of impact deviation." She set aside a cartridge that read 659.7 and picked up the next one. At 2,300 meters, that deviation compounds. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Your father did the same thing," he said. "Drove the other Marines completely out of their minds." Kuwait, the summer of 1991. "We had a position outside Kuwait City, 3 days in a hide site, and Douglas spent 4 hours one evening preparing ammunition while the rest of the team played cards and wrote letters home." He paused, and something moved through his voice that was not quite humor and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Nobody bothered him twice about it after they saw what he could do with those rounds. Dara loaded 5 cartridges into a magazine, each one selected from the batch that weighed exactly 660 grains, with no variance she could measure. She settled behind the Barrett, adjusted the bipod legs until the bubble on her scope mount read level, and looked downrange. The steel silhouette target stood at 2,000 meters, shimmering slightly in the thermal rise that came off the heated ground in slow-moving waves. "Wind," she said. Hargrove had already positioned himself with his spotting scope. 3 to 4 miles per hour, left to right. Mirage indicates it's consistent across the range. He paused. "But tell me what your Kestrel says." She checked the weather meter clipped to her shooting bag. 4.1 miles per hour, southwest. Temperature, 68 degrees. Humidity, 31%. Barometric pressure, 25.6. Hargrove made a sound that might have been approval. "Technology confirms what the land is saying. That is the correct order to run those checks. When they disagree, trust the terrain." She made the windage adjustment, one precise click at a time, each click moving her point of impact a specific fraction of an inch at the distance she was engaging. Then she shot. The Barrett's report rolled across the plateau and echoed back from the surrounding mountains, a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. The recoil drove into her shoulder with the mass and authority of a .50 caliber cartridge, but she had positioned herself correctly, absorbed it through skeletal structure rather than fought it with muscle, and she stayed in the scope through the shot, watching. 2.5 seconds later, the steel target rang. "Center mass," Hargrove said. "Solid hit." She worked the bolt, fired again, and again. The rhythm was deliberate and unhurried, because hurry at this kind of distance was just a different spelling of error. Each trigger press was identical, 4.5 pounds of pressure applied straight back until the sear released. The same motion repeated so many times across so many years that it had stopped being a conscious act and become something closer to a reflex that thought. 5 rounds, 5 impacts, all within 6 inches of each other at 2,000 meters. Hargrove pulled back from his spotting scope and looked at her with an expression that had crossed the line from professional assessment into something more personal. "That is exceptional work, Staff Sergeant." Dara was already making notes in her ballistic log, recording the temperature and wind and altitude and the precise performance of each round. She did not look up immediately. "It's not the ammunition I'll use for the shot on Salah." Hargrove tilted his head slightly. She reached for the second box. "These were loaded 3 months ago. Those were 6 months old. Powder degrades with temperature exposure over time. The degradation is minor, but at 2,300 meters, minor becomes meaningful. I need to verify which lot performs most consistently at this altitude and in these specific conditions. Hargrove set down his spotting scope and looked at her the way a man looked at something that confirmed a belief he had held for a long time and had not had sufficient evidence to defend until this moment. "Your father would have done exactly that," he said. She knew. She had learned it from him. They worked for 2 hours, 65 rounds total, testing different ammunition lots, building a verified performance profile for each one at altitude, cross-referencing the results against her existing ballistic data. The process was methodical and repetitive in the way that all serious preparation was methodical and repetitive, which was to say it looked like patience from the outside and felt like precision from the inside. Hargrove provided wind observations throughout, but they were not simply numbers. He was teaching in the way that genuine expertise expressed itself, not through instruction, but through annotation, adding context to what she already knew in ways that opened new dimensions. He pointed to a dust pattern forming on the valley floor 400 meters downrange. "See how it spirals counterclockwise? That is a thermal eddy. Rising air from the heated ground colliding with the horizontal wind. Your ballistic computer reads the surface wind speed and gives you a number, but that eddy will push your bullet up and right through that zone, and the computer cannot see it." He indicated a patch of pale grass further out. "Watch the mirage over that ground. See how it leans slightly? That is your wind gradient at 800 meters telling you the speed is 2 points higher than the surface reading." Dara watched and cataloged and understood. He showed her how to build a mental map of wind across different distances by reading the terrain features between the shooter and the target as a sequence of environmental instruments, each one providing data about conditions at its specific location along the bullet's path. Modern ballistic computers were extraordinary tools. She used one. She believed in it. But she had also seen batteries die and electronics fail and conditions shift faster than any instrument could update. And she had watched enough experienced operators lose confidence in their own judgment because they had outsourced too much of it to technology they did not fully understand. Hargrove was offering her something different, the ability to know the answer before the instrument confirmed it, and to trust that knowledge even when the instrument was not available to confirm anything at all. "Your father and I spent 3 days in a hide site together in Kuwait," he said during a pause while she cleaned the rifle between test groups. "We did not have kestrels or ballistic computers. We had a notebook and a calculator and our eyes. We mapped the wind by watching sand move across the desert floor. We calculated temperature effects by feeling how the air changed as the sun moved from east to west." He looked out across the Afghan plateau, his eyes focused on something that was not geographically present. Modern soldiers sometimes forget that the old ways are not inferior ways. They are foundational ways. The technology is built on top of them. When the technology fails, the foundation is what remains. "Will you teach me," Dara said, "the old ways, not to replace what I know, to add to it?" Hargrove looked at her for a moment before answering. The expression on his face had layers she could not entirely read. "That is exactly why I am here," he said. "That is precisely why." By the time the sun touched the western peaks, Dara had fired her last round and confirmed everything she needed to know about her equipment's performance in these specific conditions. Her shoulder ached with the deep, penetrating complaint of tissue that had absorbed recoil one time too many in one afternoon. She had been managing a developing injury in her right shoulder for 14 months, a rotator cuff problem that had begun as occasional discomfort and was progressing towards something that a doctor at Fort Bragg had described with a careful absence of drama as a timeline. 2 to 3 years, he had said, before the structural damage becomes incompatible with continued active duty. She had not told anyone else. It was the particular kind of privacy that belonged to soldiers who understood that the mission came before the body, and that the body would be dealt with when the mission permitted it. They drove back toward the base as the light went amber and long across the mountains. Hargrove was quiet with the comfortable quiet of someone who had processed something and arrived at a place of relative peace with it. "Can I ask you something personal?" Dara said. He glanced at her. "Go ahead." "You've been retired for 4 years. Admiral Aldridge said you agreed to come back without hesitation when he called." She paused. "Why?" Hargrove turned to look at the mountains for a moment, the kind of pause that meant the answer was real rather than prepared. "I have a son," he said. "Had a son. Captain Nathan Hargrove, Army Rangers. He was killed in March of 2012 in Kunar Province. An ambush." Dara felt the weight of that land in her chest without needing to be told what came next. "I'm sorry," she said. He was 29 years old, West Point graduate, Ranger qualified. Everything a father could want in a son, everything a soldier could want in a junior officer. He was good, really good. Hargrove's jaw worked briefly. "And I never trained him, never taught him the things I had spent a career learning. I was always deployed, always on the next mission, always telling myself there would be time later for the conversations that mattered." He stopped. There was not time later. They drove in silence for a minute. "When Admiral Aldridge called me," Hargrove continued, "he did not mention who the target was, just said he needed a precision strike and wanted the best wind reader available. I almost said no. I am 67 years old. My joints have opinions about that, and their opinions are not flattering. But something told me to say yes." He paused. "When I reviewed the mission file and saw Salah's operational history, I understood why." Dara waited. Tariq Saleh planned the Kunar ambush in March of 2012. Hargrove said it the way people said things that had too much weight to be said any other way. He killed Nathan, along with 3 other men whose families still carry that mourning with them every day. He looked at her directly. "Aldridge does not know. I discovered it when I read the full intelligence package 3 days ago, after I had already agreed to come. I made the decision not to inform him. I made the decision to stay." He paused. "Nathan knew who I was. He knew I was the kind of soldier who did not let personal feeling compromise professional function. I will not betray that by becoming a different person now that the stakes are personal." Dara thought about her father, about the years of teaching that had preceded every lesson with the implicit argument that discipline was not the suppression of feeling, but its proper direction. "You could have told Aldridge," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" "Because then he might have replaced me, and I considered that. I held it for a long time, but removing the most qualified spotter from this shot because of a personal connection that will not compromise my professional function is not integrity. It is the performance of integrity at the cost of the mission." Nathan would have understood that distinction. He would have made the same call. He paused. "And because I wanted to be in that hide site when the bullet lands." For Nathan, he looked at her. "And because of you." She looked at him. "Watching you today," he said, "working with Douglas's rifle, hearing the way you think about this work, the way you were taught to think about it. It is the closest I have come in 11 years to feeling like the knowledge I carry is not going to die with my generation. I never got to teach Nathan what I know, but teaching you, today, on that range, that felt like the next best thing. It felt like honoring both of them." Dara looked at the road ahead and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "He would have liked you, my father. He valued exactness in people. He used to say that a person who was precise about small things would be trustworthy in large ones." Hargrove smiled. "A real one, worn and genuine. Douglas said almost exactly that to me in Kuwait, 2 days into our first deployment together. I thought he was talking about ammunition." "He was," Dara said, "and everything else." The Tactical Operations Center was cooled by industrial units that worked against the Afghan heat with the grim determination of systems that understood their purpose. When Dara and Hargrove arrived that evening, Master Chief Boone Callard was waiting with meteorological data spread across 3 screens. The kind of comprehensive environmental analysis that modern operations made possible, and that previous generations of shooters would have considered sorcery. Callard walked them through it without preamble, because he was a man who had learned that preamble was usually just a way of postponing information. I've pulled weather from 3 sources. He indicated the screens in sequence: military weather stations, satellite feeds, and 30 days of local pattern data from our embedded assets. The valley creates specific conditions. He pulled up a topographic overlay with predicted airflow patterns mapped against it. Mornings, as the sun heats the valley floor, you get thermal updrafts. They peak between 0800 and 1000 hours. Combined with a natural wind deflection off the eastern ridge, you are looking at variable vertical and horizontal displacement in the bullet's path. He zoomed in on the compound's location. The good news is that conditions have been stable for 3 weeks. No significant weather systems forecast for the next 72 hours. Dara pulled out her notebook and began building calculations. The thermal currents added a vertical component to an already complex shot. At 2,387 meters, with the added complications of a steep downward angle, changing air density with altitude, and thermal uplift, she was looking at a hold that required her to aim at a point substantially removed from where she wanted the bullet to arrive, trusting the mathematics to carry it home. "What is your wind solution?" Hargrove said, looking over her shoulder. She showed him the figures. Thermals will add approximately 0.8 MOA of vertical deflection. Combined with the wind, she ran the calculation again, 18.2 MOA elevation hold, 4.8 MOA right for wind and thermal combined. Coriolis adds 0.3 right at this latitude. Hargrove studied the numbers, then made 2 annotations in the margin of her notebook. Here at 1,150 meters, there is a small ridge that will create a Venturi effect. Wind accelerates over it. Add another half-minute of angle right through that section. And here in this lower area, cooler air pools in the mornings. You may get a brief downdraft that partially offsets the thermal rise. He tapped the page. These are not in the instrument data. They come from reading the terrain. Dara incorporated both into her solution. They worked for an hour, building a wind map that was part meteorological data and part accumulated experience. The marriage of modern precision and old-fashioned fieldcraft that Hargrove had been describing in the abstract and was now demonstrating in the specific. Callard brought coffee at some point, the thick military-issue variety that tasted like it had been made by someone who considered the flavor an acceptable casualty of the caffeine content. Dara drank it without comment. It was nearly 2,200 hours when Admiral Aldridge entered the operations center. His expression carried news that had weight. "Staff Sergeant, Colonel." He pulled up a classified file on the secure terminal. "New intelligence from our ground assets. Saleh's communications indicate he may be departing the compound earlier than our previous analysis suggested." Dara set down her coffee. "How much earlier, sir?" "Our window has moved from 48 hours to approximately 30. Aldridge's eyes were direct and carried the quality of a senior officer delivering hard information to someone he had come to respect. "That means execution tomorrow morning rather than the day after. No second reconnaissance pass. No additional preparation time. One opportunity." Hargrove's jaw tightened fractionally, but he nodded. "We can work with that, Admiral. There is something else." Aldridge's expression shifted, and the shift was significant enough that both Dara and Hargrove went still without being told to. He pulled up a secondary file. "I have been cross-referencing Saleh's operational history against historical casualty reports as part of our background analysis." He highlighted a specific section of the document and turned the screen so they could both read it. "Operation Phantom Reach, March 2012, Kunar Province. The casualty list. 4 names. At the bottom of the list, Captain Nathan Hargrove, 75th Ranger Regiment." Dara watched Hargrove read it. She watched the precise moment when a man who had built his entire professional identity around the management of exactly this kind of impact, encountered it without warning and without the distance of preparation. He stood. The chair scraped back against the floor with a sound that was too loud in the quiet room. He walked to the far wall, his back to them, his shoulders carrying 11 years of a particular kind of grief that had found its architecture in work, in discipline, in the daily decision to keep moving forward. Aldridge said quietly, "Colonel, I did not make this connection until tonight. If I had known, I would not have asked you to come. I can arrange a replacement spotter within—" "No, sir." Hargrove's voice was even. Not performing steadiness, actually steady, the kind built at genuine cost over a very long time. He turned around. His face was composed. His eyes were not entirely dry, but they were clear. The expression of a man who had arrived at something through suffering rather than around it. "I am exactly where I need to be," he said. He looked at Aldridge directly. "Nathan died in service of something he believed in. If I walk away from this because it became personal, I am saying that my comfort matters more than what he gave his life for." He paused. "That is not something I am willing to say." Aldridge studied him for a long moment, with the assessment of a flag officer who understood the difference between bravery and recklessness, between commitment and self-destruction. He nodded. Dara moved to stand beside Hargrove, not close enough to crowd, close enough to be present. She had learned from her father that the most important thing you could offer another person in a moment of real grief was not words. It was witness. After a moment, she said, "Let me be the student you did not get to train. Let me carry this forward the way he would have wanted you to. That is how the things we sacrifice for stay meaningful." Hargrove looked at her. The transformation was visible. Not instant, not complete, but real. Grief finding its channel, loss finding its direction. "You sound like Douglas," he said. She had been told that before. "We have 30 hours, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had decided something and was no longer spending energy on the decision. "Let's make them count." Aldridge straightened. He had the look of a commander who had just witnessed something he did not entirely understand, but recognized as important. "Then we have work to do," he said, and the three of them turned back to the maps. Outside, the Afghan night pressed against the reinforced walls of the operations center with the patient indifference of mountains that had been standing long before any of them were born, and would be standing long after the last record of this mission had been declassified and filed and eventually forgotten. But the work was not forgotten, not yet, and in 30 hours it would be finished. The convoy departed FOB Keller at 0300 hours without lights. 3 vehicles moving through mountain darkness with the particular discipline of people who understood that visibility was a form of vulnerability, and that vulnerability in this terrain, at this hour, was a form of dying that simply had not completed its paperwork yet. The road was not a road in any conventional sense. It was a negotiation between the vehicle and the mountain, a series of compromises made at low speed with complete attention. Dara sat in the second vehicle with Hargrove, both of them silent in the way that experienced soldiers were silent before an operation. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, the silence of people who had already said what needed saying and were now conserving the internal resources that the next several hours would require. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Fenn rode in the lead vehicle with his SEAL team. 8 operators in full kit, night vision mounted, weapons indexed and ready. Fenn had said 4 words to Dara before they loaded up, standing in the amber glow of the operations center doorway with his team staged behind him. "We've got your back." It was not an apology. It was something more durable than an apology. It was a statement of professional commitment from a man who had revised his understanding of something fundamental and was demonstrating that revision through action rather than language. She had nodded. He had nodded. That was sufficient. The drive took 2 hours, following valleys and ridgelines that Fenn's team had reconnoitered during the preceding day. avoiding known Taliban positions and the stretches of road where IED activity had been documented in the past 6 months. The mountains were vast and dark and indifferent, wearing the night like something they had always owned. They stopped 3 kilometers from the objective in a shallow depression that provided minimal visual signature from the surrounding high ground. From here, the last kilometer would be on foot. The final 50 meters would be on hands and knees. Last movement before we reach the hide site, Fenn said quietly. Maintain separation. Watch your footing. No light discipline violations. He looked at Dara briefly. You're on point with Hargrove once we reach the split. We'll establish perimeter at the tree line. She shouldered her drag bag. 62 pounds of rifle, optic, ammunition, and support equipment distributed across her frame with the careful geometry of someone who had learned that the way you carried weight determined how much of it remained available to carry at the end. Hargrove moved beside her with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this kind of movement more times than he could accurately remember, and whose body retained the knowledge even when the joints complained about its application. They moved in tactical file through ground that offered no kindness. The terrain was steep and loose in alternating sections, demanding full attention from every footfall. The air at this altitude in the pre-dawn hours carried a cold that had teeth, and Dara felt it finding the gaps in her kit and making its presence known in her extremities with methodical thoroughness. She did not allow herself to think about the shot yet. That was a discipline her father had taught her. The preparation and the execution were different mental states, and moving between them prematurely was how otherwise capable people introduced error into work that could not afford error. They were 100 meters from the planned hide site when Hargrove's fist came up. The entire element went still. 12 people becoming part of the landscape in the space of a single breath, which was the kind of thing that looked effortless from the outside and represented years of trained reflex from the inside. Dara heard it 3 seconds after Hargrove signaled. Voices, Pashto, carried on the cold air from the ridge above their position. Male voices in the unhurried register of men who believed they were alone in their mountains at this hour. Fenn's hand signals were precise and immediate. Down. Women ready. Hold. The team melted into the ground. 6 fighters moved along a trail on the ridge above them, their path carrying them in a direction that would bring them within 30 meters of the team's position if they continued on their current line. They carried AK variants and moved with the casual confidence of men on familiar ground, observant in the way relaxed people were, genuinely and without the tunnel vision that fear or urgency produced. Dara's finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger of her M4, not because she intended to fire, but because preparation for contingency was not optional. Beside her, Hargrove was absolutely motionless. Not the frozen stillness of fear, the deep stillness of someone who had learned, across decades of operations in hostile ground, that the human eye was drawn to movement, and that the absence of movement was the closest approximation to invisibility available to a person without actual camouflage technology. One of the fighters stopped. He stood 15 meters from their position and looked directly toward the shallow depression where 12 American operators lay pressed against the earth. And the moment stretched in the way that certain moments did, expanding beyond their chronological size to accommodate the weight of what they contained. Dara's heart rate was 51 beats per minute. The fighter said something to his companions, gestured with his rifle toward the general area of their position. His companion responded with the tone of someone explaining why concern was unnecessary. They stood there for 90 seconds that each contained approximately 4 times the normal amount of time. Then the patrol moved on. Fenn waited 10 additional minutes before signaling movement. The kind of patience that looked excessive until you had been on the wrong end of a patrol that doubled back. They reached the hide site at 04:47 hours. The position was a natural depression in the rock face of the ridgeline, barely large enough for 2 people lying prone, offering a direct line of sight across the valley to the compound, where intelligence said Tariq Saleh, would appear in approximately 2.5 hours. The mountains on the far side of the valley were turning from black to dark gray as the earth began its slow rotation toward morning. Dara and Hargrove established the position with the unhurried precision of people who understood that the quality of their setup now would determine the quality of their options later. The Barrett on its bipod, bubble level confirming horizontal. The ballistic computer within reach but not between her and the rifle. 5 rounds of her best ammunition, weighed and verified, staged in a sequence that matched her planned engagement order. Hargrove's spotting scope positioned 2 feet behind and slightly left, giving him a complimentary view of the target area without crowding her position or creating the kind of shared body heat that thermal imaging could detect. His rangefinder painted the balcony of the compound's main structure. 2,387 meters, he said quietly. Confirmed. She marked the number and let it settle. Not a goal, a fact. One of many facts that the next several hours would arrange into either a successful outcome or an honest accounting of where the preparation had been insufficient. As false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Hargrove began pointing out terrain features in a low, continuous narration that was part briefing and part the kind of teaching that only worked in context. Those prayer flags at 1,150 meters, watch how they move. That is your primary wind indicator for the mid-range section of the bullet's path. He traced a line through the air. The dust near that compound structure at 1,600 meters will show you the thermal development as the sun comes up. The dry grass at 800 meters will tell you if a surface wind shifts direction. She watched and cataloged and asked 3 questions. He answered all 3 with the focused attention of someone for whom teaching was not a secondary activity, but a form of the same precision he brought to everything else. The valley emerged from darkness as the sun began its work on the eastern peaks. The compound became visible in detail. Guard posts at the perimeter corners, 2 vehicles in the central courtyard, technical trucks with crew-served weapons mounted in their beds. The balcony of the main structure, empty, a rectangle of concrete approximately 4 meters wide and 3 meters deep, elevated 6 meters above ground level. At 0630, movement on the balcony brought Dara's finger toward the trigger guard. Hargrove's hand touched her shoulder. Light pressure. Not yet. 2 guards. They stepped onto the balcony, swept the surrounding mountains with binoculars in a systematic pattern that demonstrated training, scanned the ridgelines, including the one where Dara and Hargrove lay invisible in their depression, and then withdrew inside after 3 minutes. Precautionary sweep, Hargrove said. Pattern behavior. They'll do it again before Saleh comes out. They waited. At 0715, the wind changed. Dara felt it on her face before any indicator confirmed it. A shift in direction, the temperature differential of air coming from a slightly different quarter, the particular sensory information that years of paying attention to weather had made legible to her in ways she could not entirely translate into language. Wind change, she said. Hargrove was already reading his kestrel. 7 to 8 miles per hour. West-southwest. Direction has moved 15 degrees from our solution baseline. She pulled out her notebook. The shift changed her windage solution substantially. At 2,387 meters, 15 degrees of wind direction change at increased velocity moved the impact point by several feet. Everything she had calculated needed revision. She worked through the new numbers with the focused efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this possibility. Because she had learned from her father, and from 11 months in these mountains, that conditions on the day of execution were never identical to conditions during planning, and that the difference between a shooter who could adapt and a shooter who could not was the difference between mission success and mission failure. New solution, she said, and read the figures aloud. 4.8 MOA right for wind and thermal combined. 18.2 MOA elevation hold unchanged. Coriolis 0.3 right unchanged. Hargrove looked at his kestrel, then at the prayer flags, then at the dust patterns on the valley floor. His eyes moved across the terrain with the systematic attention of a man building a real-time environmental model from multiple data streams simultaneously. "My instrument says 4.6, he said. "My eyes say 5.0. He paused. "Split the difference, 4.8. "When technology and fieldcraft disagree at the margins, average them and trust the average." She made the scope adjustments, each click precise and counted, the mechanical translation of mathematics into metal movement. At 07:34, the balcony door opened again. A figure stepped out, male, appropriate height and build. The guards flanked him with the positioning of men protecting a principal. Dara's crosshairs settled on his chest. The shot was there, clean, available. Her finger moved to the trigger and found 4.5 pounds waiting. She looked. The figure walked to the railing and stood with his weight distributed slightly differently than the photographs in the intelligence package had shown. Not substantially, marginally, the kind of detail that most people would not register. She registered it. The weight was on the right foot rather than the left, a subtle lean that Salah's operational profile, compiled from 47 separate surveillance reports over 14 months, did not include. "Negative," she said. "Stand by." Hargrove pulled back from his scope. "What do you see?" "Weight distribution. He is favoring his right side. Nothing in the profile suggests a right side injury or habitual lean." She kept watching. The figure performed morning prayers and then withdrew after 3 minutes, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone in a familiar and secure environment. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Saleh is testing, sending someone of similar profile to see whether a shot comes. If you had fired, he would have known there was a shooter on this ridgeline and disappeared for another 6 months." She had seen it. The mathematics of observation, her father had called it. The shot that should not be taken was sometimes the more difficult discipline than the shot that should. The next 11 minutes were among the longest she had experienced in 11 months of operations in these mountains. The entire team on the ridgeline held position without movement while the compound below returned to its apparent routine, and the question of whether their position remained unknown stayed open and unanswered and heavy. Fenn's voice came through her earpiece at sub-audible volume. "Good call, Phantom. We're holding." At 07:41, the balcony door opened for the third time. 2 guards emerged first. They took positions flanking the doorway, and their body language was different from the previous iterations. The compact attentiveness of men who were protecting rather than checking, which was a distinction visible to anyone who had spent enough time watching the way people moved when they believed something genuinely important was about to happen. A third figure stepped out between them. He moved with the particular quality of someone who had been giving orders for a long time and had stopped needing to think about whether they would be obeyed. Not arrogance, something more settled than arrogance. The assumption of authority that had become so naturalized it no longer required performance. Dara compared what she saw through 35 power magnification against the imagery from 47 surveillance reports processed over 14 months and stored in the specific kind of memory that years of this work developed in the people who survived it. Beard pattern, build, height, the way he moved his left hand when standing still, the angle at which he held his chin. Positive identification, Hargrove said, his voice absolutely level. "That is Tariq Saleh." Saleh walked to the balcony railing and faced east for morning prayers. The guards pulled back to the flanking positions, creating the clear sight line that intelligence had predicted and that she had been waiting 3 hours in cold rock and thin air to see. 90 seconds. That was the window. Hargrove's voice came low and steady, the voice of a man who had made this call hundreds of times and understood that the quality of the information he delivered in the next few seconds was the most important contribution he could make to anything that came after this. Wind 7.8, west-southwest. Thermals consistent and stable. Range confirmed 2,387 meters. Hold 18.2 MOA high, 4.8 MOA right. Coriolis, 0.3 right. He paused for a single breath. Send it when ready. For Douglas. For Nathan. Dara's world narrowed. This was the place she had been trained to reach, the state that her father had described to her on a cold Montana morning as the place where all the preparation stopped being preparation and became simply what you were. Heart rate, 48 beats per minute. Respiratory rate, 5 cycles per minute. The tremor that lived in every human hand at the threshold of perception, reduced by stillness and technique, and the accumulated discipline of 19 years to something below the threshold of mechanical significance. The crosshairs settled high and right of Salah's chest, not where she wanted the bullet to arrive, where the mathematics of distance and wind and gravity and the rotation of the earth said she needed to send it in order for it to arrive where she needed it to be. She trusted the mathematics. She had built it herself, verified it herself, tested it against reality until the gap between calculation and outcome was as small as human precision could make it. She thought of her father kneeling in the frost-stiff Montana grass when she was 8 years old, his hands over hers, his voice patient and exact. The rifle tells you exactly what you give it. She gave it everything she had. The trigger broke clean at 4.5 pounds. The Barrett spoke with the authority of a .50 caliber cartridge being released into thin mountain air at an elevation of 8,000 feet. The report rolling across the valley in both directions simultaneously, echoing off the far mountains and returning changed, the way all things return changed after contact with something larger than themselves. She stayed in the scope. 3.2 seconds. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,710 feet per second and began immediately to negotiate with the physical laws that governed everything that moved through air. Gravity asserted itself. The wind pushed from the west-southwest at 7.8 miles per hour. The thermal currents rising from the valley floor below created subtle vertical deflection. The rotation of the Earth added its small, precise contribution to the deviation. All of it was accounted for. All of it was already in the mathematics she had aimed. Hargrove's voice. Tracking. Flight looks good. 3.2 seconds was not a long time. It contained within it the accumulated effort of a childhood spent learning to be still, an adolescence spent learning to be precise, years of service spent learning to be both simultaneously under conditions that did not reward anything less than the full application of both. It contained her father's hands guiding her small ones in the frost-stiff grass. It contained the worn piece of paper in her jacket pocket. Impact. Hargrove's voice cracked for the first time in 35 years of calling shots. Center mass. Confirmed kill. Target is down. Then, barely audible, the words he had come 6,000 miles and 11 years to say. For Nathan. The compound erupted. Guards moved in multiple directions at once. The disorganized reaction of an organization whose leadership had just been removed with surgical precision and without warning. Someone fired an AK toward the mountains, the rounds landing 400 meters to Dara's left, which was either a guess or a thermal contact, and either way was not close enough to require immediate repositioning. She chambered a second round. The Barrett's bolt cycled with the smooth authority of a weapon that had been maintained with religious consistency and intended to function under conditions that would compromise lesser equipment. She stayed in position, scanning, because the mission was not complete until the assault team was on the ground and the compound was secured, and everyone who had come up this mountain was on their way back down it. Then the PKM opened up. The crew-served machine gun was on a rooftop position that had not appeared in any of the satellite imagery or the reconnaissance photographs or the intelligence package assembled from 14 months of surveillance. It was firing toward the 2 Black Hawk helicopters that Fenn's assault team was approaching in, the heavy caliber rounds stitching lines through the air in patterns that were entirely too close to the aircraft to be acceptable. Hargrove had the position before Dara could ask. PKM, rooftop, 2,250 meters, 11 o'clock from your previous shot. Same wind, reduced drop. Hold 16 MOA high, 4.5 right. No time for the ritual of preparation. No time for the breathing cycle, the heart rate reduction, the deliberate narrowing of attention that preceded a measured shot. There was only the training, the 10,000 hours of repetition that had made the fundamentals automatic, and the trust that what had been built over 19 years would function correctly in the seconds available. Her right shoulder absorbed the Barrett's recoil with a specific and meaningful pain that she noted and filed for later consideration. 8 seconds from target identification to shot. The PKM fell silent. Hargrove confirmed. Target down. Gun is neutralized. The Blackhawks swept in, fast ropes deployed. Fenn's team moved with the compressed violence of people who had prepared extensively for exactly this, and were now executing without the luxury of adjustment or reconsideration. The sounds of the compound assault were brief and definitive, the sounds of a prepared force engaging a disorganized one, which was the intended result of the work that had preceded it. Fenn's voice came through the radio 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the assault element hit the ground. Compound secure. Sala confirmed KIA. 2 secondary commanders in custody. Intelligence materials being collected. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had the particular quality of a man saying something he had thought about carefully. 0 casualties. He paused again. Outstanding work, Phantom. Best Overwatch support this team has ever received. Dara remained in position for 20 additional minutes, providing cover while Fenn's team completed their exploitation of the compound. Only when Fenn confirmed extraction readiness did she begin the process of disengaging from the hide site. Her right arm, when she tried to raise it above shoulder height to break down the Barrett, did not comply with the instruction. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical finality of catastrophic injury, simply with the quiet refusal of a joint that had been asked to perform beyond its structural capacity one time past its tolerance threshold. The shoulder would function. It would function for the extraction, for the helicopter ride back, for the debrief, for whatever came immediately after. But the conversation she had been postponing with a doctor at Fort Bragg had just moved from eventual to immediate. Hargrove saw it. He did not say anything. He moved to help her break down the equipment with the understated practicality of someone who understood that the correct response to a colleague's limitation was assistance, not commentary. They extracted clean. The Black Hawk lifted them off the ridgeline as the Afghan sun climbed toward the position it would occupy for the hottest part of the day, turning the mountains gold and amber in the particular shade of bronze that she had seen in photographs her father had taken during Desert Storm, and that she now understood was not a quality of the light in desert countries specifically, but of the quality of attention you brought to looking at things when you understood they might be the last things you saw. The landing at FOB Keller happened at 11:04 hours. She was not prepared for what was waiting at the LZ. The entire task force had assembled. Every SEAL from the planning and execution teams, support personnel, the base's small administrative staff, 40 people in the Afghan heat, standing in the informal approximation of formation that operators use when the occasion called for acknowledgement, but not ceremony. Admiral Aldridge stood at the front. When Dara cleared the rotor wash and became fully visible, he began to clap. The sound was taken up immediately and completely, rolling across the LZ and echoing off the HESCO barriers with the particular resonance of genuine recognition, which sounded different from performed recognition in ways that were difficult to specify but impossible to mistake. She stopped walking. Snipers worked in shadows. Their successes were measured in the lives of people who came home, rather than the recognition of the people responsible for that outcome. This kind of acknowledgement was foreign to the professional culture she had spent her adult life inside. It felt exposed. and simultaneously like something she had not known she needed until it was happening. Hargrove touched her elbow. Just pressure, just presence. She walked forward. Aldridge waited until the applause subsided, then addressed the assembled group with the command presence of someone who had given thousands of speeches and understood the difference between performance and communication. 48 hours ago, he said, I stood in a briefing room and questioned whether Staff Sergeant Winslow belonged on this mission. I looked at her rank and her uniform, and I let my assumptions do work that my judgment should have been doing. He paused. I almost made the worst professional decision of my career. This morning, Staff Sergeant Winslow made a shot at 2,387 meters under changing wind conditions with a thermal component and a steep downward angle, and she made it correctly. And then she made a second shot at 2,250 meters in under 10 seconds to neutralize a threat that would have cost us people we cannot afford to lose. He looked at Dara directly. Every man on the assault team came home because of her work. That is the only metric that matters in this profession. He produced a challenge coin from his jacket pocket, the task force's commemorative token, awarded only for performance that exceeded what the situation required. He held it out to her. Staff Sergeant Dara Winslow, he said, on behalf of this task force and Naval Special Warfare Command, I present this in recognition of extraordinary marksmanship and professionalism under combat conditions. He paused. And personally, as the godfather of a young officer named Callum, who called me this morning to tell me that his daughter took her first steps today and that he was there to see them, because 18 months ago, someone brought him home. He had to stop for a moment. His voice, when it returned, was steadier than his expression. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. From Callum, from his wife, from a little girl who will grow up knowing her father. Dara accepted the coin. She held it without speaking for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not the weight of metal. You were doing your job, sir, she said. You did not know me. I respect a commander who questions unknown variables. Aldridge shook his head. No, Staff Sergeant, I had your file. I chose not to read it carefully because my assumptions told me what the answer already was. That is not rigor. That is its opposite. He turned to Hargrove. The second coin he produced was different, older. He had found it in his own collection, a Desert Storm-era token from a Joint Operations Command that no longer existed by that name. Colonel Raymond Hargrove, he said, you came back from retirement and gave this mission something more valuable than meteorological expertise. You gave it institutional memory that cannot be replaced when it is gone. And you gave it to someone who will carry it forward. He extended the coin. For 35 years of service, for coming back when it mattered. Welcome home, Granite. Hargrove took the coin. He came to attention in civilian clothes, which was something that could not be taught or faked, and rendered a salute that carried the weight of a career. Aldridge returned it with equal precision. When Hargrove's hand came down, his face was wet. He did not attempt to address it. Some things were beyond the reach of military discipline, and this was one of them. Fenn approached Dara after the formation dispersed. He stood in front of her for a moment, with the expression of a man assembling words that had been in preparation for some time. I told Admiral Aldridge this morning that I want to formally revise the sniper candidate evaluation criteria I have been using for this team. He approved the revision. He looked at her directly. That is what accountability looks like when it is genuine. I want you to know that it is genuine. She believed him. Callard, last of the senior operators to approach, shook her hand with the grip of someone who had decided after 30 years of service that the remaining time was best spent being exactly as honest as the situation permitted. In 30 years as a SEAL, he said, I have learned that capability does not care about the things we assume it cares about. It only cares about the work. He nodded once. You did the work. It has been an honor. Specialist Hallie Pruitt found Dara near the edge of the assembly area as the crowd dispersed. She was 23 years old with the sunburn of someone who spent most of her working hours outside and the bearing of someone who was taking careful inventory of everything that was happening around her. She stopped at a respectful distance. Staff Sergeant Winslow. Her voice was steady but carried effort beneath the steadiness. I am Specialist Hallie Pruitt, Base Security. I have submitted 3 applications to the Sniper Candidate Program. All 3 have been declined. She paused. I wanted you to know that what you did today means something beyond this mission. It means that the answer to those declines is not final. Hargrove moved to stand beside Dara, which Pruitt had not expected. She adjusted without missing a beat. Specialist Pruitt, Hargrove said, I am 67 years old. I have spent my career learning the wrong lessons about certain things and the right lessons about others. He looked at her with the direct attention of someone choosing his words with care. If you want to do this work, here is what I can tell you from 40 years of watching people succeed and fail at it. Master the fundamentals before anything else. Find a mentor who will teach you correctly and push you honestly. Honor the tradition by adding to it rather than simply carrying it. The rest will follow. Dara said, you are not proving something to them. Every application you submitted, every standard you met or exceeded, every morning you trained when it would have been easier not to. You are building a path for the person who comes after you. That is the work that matters beyond the individual. Pruitt's expression did the thing that young soldiers' expressions did when they received information that reorganized something they had been carrying. She blinked once, straightened almost imperceptibly. Thank you, she said. Both of you. She walked away differently than she had arrived. Hargrove watched her go. That is what this is really about, he said. Beyond the missions, beyond the capability, the part that survives. Yes, Dara said, that is exactly what it is about. The equipment room was quiet that evening, cooled to a temperature that required nothing from the people inside it, except the work they had come to do. Dara sat on a metal stool with the Barrett disassembled on the cleaning mat, running a bore brush through the barrel with the methodical attention of someone performing an act that was simultaneously maintenance and something else entirely. 67 rounds through the weapon in 2 days, 65 on the range, 2 in combat. Each one had to be accounted for. Hargrove brought coffee and settled onto a nearby equipment case and watched her work. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had shared something significant and were in no hurry to reduce it to language. He pulled out the Desert Storm logbook from his jacket pocket. The leather cover was worn to the softness of something very old and very used. He opened it to the last page, where new writing appeared in Dara's precise handwriting, added during the debrief 2 hours earlier. April 2023, FOB, Keller, Afghanistan. Commander Tariq Saleh, 2,387 meters. Wind 7, 8 miles per hour west-southwest. Temperature 68 degrees. 1 round. Center mass. Confirmed kill. Below it, 2 signatures. Sergeant D. Winslow, Phantom. Colonel R. Hargrove, Granite. He traced the entry with his finger. Then he pushed the logbook across the mat between them. This belongs to you now. Dara set down the bore brush. She looked at the logbook, then at him. Wyatt, it is our history now. He said it with the finality of someone who had made a decision and was presenting it rather than proposing it. Douglas's rifle, my logbook, your legacy. That is how these things survive. Not in institutions, not in official records, in the people who carry the knowledge forward and make it useful again. She picked up the logbook. The physical weight of leather and paper was modest. The other weight was not. Add your future shots, he said. Every mission, every range session that changes something in how you understand the work. Build on what I started. Then someday, when you are 67 years old and your joints have opinions, and there is a young shooter who needs what you know, you hand it to them. He looked toward the door and threw it toward something she could not see from her position. Maybe Specialist Pruitt, he said. She has the fire. Dara opened the logbook to the first entry. Kuwait, 1991. 1,600 meters. A shot that had mattered enough to record. She turned through 32 years of entries, watching Hargrove's handwriting change in small ways across the decades, watching the geography shift from desert to African coastline to Middle Eastern cities to these mountains, watching the accumulated evidence of a life spent doing one thing with exceptional dedication and passing that dedication forward to anyone willing to receive it. She turned to the blank pages at the back. I came back thinking this was about Nathan, Hargrove said quietly, about finally closing a debt that had been open for 11 years. Was it? Partly. He looked at her. But what I found was different from what I came for. I found out that what Nathan sacrificed, what Douglas sacrificed, what all of them sacrificed, it did not end. It continued. In you. In the way you work. In the way you teach Pruitt without being asked to. He looked at the logbook in her hands. The knowledge did not die with them. It came forward. You are the proof of that. Dara felt her throat constrict with the particular emotion that she had learned to manage, but had never managed to eliminate, which was the right outcome because some things should not be eliminated. You gave me the gift your son never received, she said, the chance to learn from someone who had mastered the work. I will honor that. Every shot I take for the rest of my career. They shook hands across the cleaning mat, the grip firm and sustained, communicating what the available language was not quite equal to. Admiral Aldridge entered the equipment room shortly after, changed from his duty uniform into something that suggested the formality of the day was finished, and the part that was simply human had begun. He pulled up a stool without asking permission, which was the prerogative of his rank, and which he used with the ease of someone who had earned it. I spoke with JSOC this evening, he said. Told them what happened here. He looked at Dara. I told them I nearly made an irreplaceable error. I told them that if I ever require precision shooting at extreme range again, I will be requesting you specifically. Not because of the call sign, because of the professional. He paused. I also told them that calling Colonel Hargrove back was the best tactical decision I have made in years, and that we are losing institutional knowledge at a rate we cannot sustain. That the people who carry the old ways need to be passing them to the next generation before they are gone. I appreciate that, Admiral, Hargrove said, though I am still retired after this. One mission was the correct amount. My joints agree. Aldridge smiled, the smile of a man who had been in the presence of something he recognized as rare and was still processing his gratitude for it. He stood to leave, paused at the door and looked back at Dara. Callum's daughter is named Eleanor, he said. She will be 2 years old this summer. He stood with the expression of a man holding something that mattered more than anything in his operational career. He gets to be there for all of it. He looked at Dara. You gave him that. You gave Eleanor her father. He came briefly to attention and rendered a salute that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the thing that rank existed to protect. She returned it. After he left, Dara finished cleaning the Barrett in the quiet of the equipment room. Each component inspected, lubricated, and returned to its housing with the respect owed to a tool that had performed as asked. The serial number on the receiver read M82-041-DW. She ran her thumb across the letters. She opened the logbook to a blank page near the end, uncapped her pen, and wrote not the technical data of a shot already recorded, but a note addressed to people who could not read it and would not need to. To Dad and Nathan Hargrove, the tradition continues. The knowledge passes forward. The legacy lives. We will not let it die. We will honor what you started by teaching those who come after us. This is my oath. Dara Winslow, Phantom. She closed the logbook, placed it carefully in her pack beside the photograph of her father. The worn piece of paper was already there, where it had always been. Tomorrow she would be on a transport back to Fort Bragg, back to the routine of the work between the moments that defined it, back to the physical therapy appointments and the honest conversations with doctors, and the quiet management of a body that had given more than it had been built to give, and had done so without complaint because she had asked it to. Medical retirement was coming. She had made her peace with that. The knowledge would not retire with her. It would continue in the people she had taught, and the people they would teach, and the unbroken line of those who understood that the work was never finished, only passed forward. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, jacket on, ready for whatever sleep the night would offer a 67-year-old man who had come back to these mountains for the last time and found what he had not known he was looking for. "Get some sleep, Wyatt," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had arrived at something. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Never let that stop being true." After he left, she sat alone in the quiet equipment room with the Barrett in the logbook and the particular piece of someone who has done the work they were built to do and done it as well as it could be done. And who knows that what comes next, whatever form it takes, will be built on a foundation that was worth building. Outside, the Afghan mountains stood in the darkness as they had stood for 10,000 years, indifferent and enormous, wearing away everything that was not essential. What was essential remained. It always did. 3 years later, Fort Bragg Sniper Training Facility, April 2026. The room was small and deliberately plain, the kind of space that existed for function rather than impression. 2 chairs, a table, a camera on a tripod that Staff Sergeant Hallie Pruitt had set up herself, with the same methodical care she brought to everything she had learned to do in the preceding 36 months. She wore her sniper tab the way people wore things they had earned at genuine cost. Not proudly exactly, accurately, as information rather than decoration. Sergeant First Class Dara Winslow sat across from her. 30 years old, her right shoulder showed the subtle asymmetry of something that had been repaired and was healing at the pace that honest repair required. Medical retirement had been filed, processed, and scheduled. The Army had given her a date. She had given it a task first. Pruitt adjusted the camera and looked across the table. She had thought about this interview for 6 months, about what question to begin with, about what the story actually was at its center. She had settled on the honest one. "They say the shot was impossible," she said. "What were you thinking when you took it?" Dara was quiet for a moment, not gathering words, letting the question find its proper weight. "I was thinking about my father," she said, "kneeling in the grass in Montana when I was 8 years old, his hands over mine, telling me the rifle would tell me exactly what I gave it." She paused. "I was thinking about Colonel Hargrove standing 2 feet behind me in the dark, 35 years of knowledge compressed into a wind call. And I was thinking about the people who did not come back, the ones who made it possible for me to be standing there." She set her hand on the rifle case beside her chair. M82-041-DW. "The shot was not mine," she said. "It was theirs, through my hands." Pruitt nodded slowly, writing nothing down because she had learned that some information was best carried in the body rather than on paper. "Colonel Hargrove," she said. "I never got to meet him." Dara looked at the logbook on the table between them. The leather cover was worn to the softness of something very old and very used. A Desert Storm entry on the first page, an April 2023 entry near the back. And after it, in the same precise handwriting, but with a different quality of weight, entries from a sniper school classroom in North Carolina, from a training range in Colorado, from the months she had spent teaching the fundamentals her father had taught her and Hargrove had deepened, and that she had been passing forward, one shooter at a time, before the shoulder made the decision for her. "He passed away in the spring of 2024, she said, quietly, at home in Montana. He knew by then." Knew what? That it had not ended with him. She looked at Pruitt directly. "He used to say that knowledge left unshared was knowledge that died. He shared everything he had. And now you are here." She nodded once. He knew. Pruitt looked at the logbook for a long moment. Is that what this is really about? She asked. Not the shot, not the mission, the passing forward. Dara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. My father taught me, she said. Hargrove taught me. I taught you. Someday you will teach the next one. She paused. The shot is one morning. The teaching is everything else. Outside the window of the training facility, the Fort Bragg sniper range stretched in the flat Carolina light. Young soldiers moved through positions, working fundamentals, building the foundation that everything else required. One of them, a specialist whose name Dara had been watching for 3 months, was showing the others something about bipod placement that she had learned from Dara 2 weeks before. The knowledge moved. It did what knowledge did when people cared enough to pass it honestly. Pruitt reached across the table and opened the logbook to the last entry Dara had written. Not a shot, not a wind call or a range reading. 4 lines in the same precise handwriting that had recorded 30 years of operations across 2 generations. To Dad and Nathan Hargrove, the tradition continues, the knowledge passes forward, the legacy lives. We will not let it die. Below it, a space left blank. Waiting. Pruitt looked up. Is that space for me? Dara pushed the logbook across the table. It is for whoever earns it, she said, the same way everything in there was earned. Pruitt looked at the logbook for a long time. Then she picked it up with both hands, carefully, the way you picked up something that had weight beyond its physical measure. Outside, the range was busy with the ordinary work of people becoming what they were capable of becoming, which was the most important work there was, and which would continue long after the names in the logbook had faded, and the specific details of specific missions had been absorbed into the larger story of what it meant to do the work with honesty and precision, and the understanding that excellence, real excellence, was never the end of something. It was always the beginning of what needed to be passed forward. The Barrett M82 sat in its case beside Dara's chair. M82-041-DW. Douglas Winslow's rifle. Dara Winslow's inheritance. The next person's foundation. The tradition continued. It always would.